Hello, welcome to the Theology Pugcast. We are really glad to be with you. And today we've got a live audience in Huntsville, Alabama. All right, very good. And today, we never assume that people are familiar with us, and so we go around the horn and introduce ourselves. So I'm C.R. Wiley. I'm a pastor, and I serve a church in the Pacific Northwest, just outside of Portland. I live on the Normal side of the river in Washington. And so I've written some books. I've been a college professor. I've taught philosophy. I've also been a contractor and a real estate investor, commercial real estate. So I've done a number of things. But that's me. Tom, why don't you talk about yourself?
I'm Tom Price, like Chris, in being a distinct kind of person in a distinct kind of environment, like Washington State. I'm like that here in Connecticut. A fish without water kind of thing. I teach theology, systematic theology, Christian ethics, and philosophy. One of the places is Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary.
Yeah, so great, Tom. Thanks for the introduction. And Glenn, why don't you tell us about yourself? And then why don't you just go ahead and bring us into the subject of the day, because it's your day today, Glenn.
Yeah, I'm Glenn Sunshine. I'm a retired history professor emeritus from Central Connecticut State University. I'm a senior fellow at the Colson Center for Christian Worldview, and my main gig is as a ministry associate with Reflections Ministries. And I also do the podcast and a few other things. Right. So that's me. Our topic today is Romanticism. And what I want to do is talk a little bit about where it came from. And there are a lot of things that can be said about Romanticism, good and bad. So being who we are, we'll start with the bad and try to get to the good before we're done. So let's start off with the environment in which Romanticism arose. We're dealing with the early 19th century in Europe, early 1800s. And this was a really tumultuous period culturally in Europe. We had the Enlightenment. And actually, we've moved past the Enlightenment now, and we're into the era in which more extreme versions of rationalism and empiricism are arising, things like positivism. We have the French Revolution and Napoleon, which spread chaos across Europe. We have also, courtesy of Napoleon, we have a lot of people who are developing a sort of nationalist idea. They're tired of being in empires and they want to have their own nation states. And what you get is a rising anti-French nationalism, actually, after Napoleon's empire. That's going to help shape Romanticism as well. Then you have the Industrial Revolution, which is changing things substantially for a lot of the working class people in Europe and is producing a lot of stresses within society. So this combination of all of these different elements not surprisingly, produces a backlash. And we see the beginnings of this already during the period of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is usually referred to as the Age of Reason. That's an old term that was used for it. But what most people don't know is that there is also a sort of counter-movement in the late 18th century that's referred to as the Age of Sentiment. It's where emotion and feeling and things like that are pushed forward ahead of reason. It's sort of a counter-enlightenment in a lot of ways. And one of the key figures in this movement is an old friend of ours, Jean-Jacques Rousseau.
Oh.
Yeah. If I can't figure out how to get Plague in, I've got to get Rousseau. They're about at the same level. So what you see happening, like I said, is a backlash against all of these things. There's a growing emphasis on, for example, this is one of the things that arguably is positive coming out of it. You have a sort of desire to return to a golden age before the stresses of the modern world. So there's a huge interest in medievalism. And you get people studying, the Brothers Grimm, who are actually linguists, go back to try to collect all the old stories that they can find. You have a burst of interest in Arthur. You get romantic artists like Rackham and others illustrating these stories, new interest in fairy tales, all these kinds of things that had been rejected by the Enlightenment.
Now, one of the
But
things we can kind of insert here is there's also an architectural expression of this. So during the colonial period and the formation of the United States, that was kind of a time in which the classical era, Rome, Greece, and sort of what was believed to be kind of the rational sort of way of thinking about the world was lionized. And then in the 19th century, you have the rise of Gothic architecture, and you see that in some of the Gothic cottages where you have the arched windows and stained glass being brought even into homes. And so there's a lot of you can just drive through many towns in New England, and you can kind of note when those houses were built based on what the architectural fads were at the time. And like the middle of the 19th century, that was the Gothic period.
Yeah. Personally, I'm hoping that when we actually buy a house, I'll be able to put in gargoyles.
Here's the gargoyles.
Yeah. So along with this, this is connected internationalism. People are looking into the roots of their own society. They want to go back to this more pristine era before all of the pollution of modernism entered the world. Okay, so we have that on the one hand, and there are genuinely good things that come out of that. But because of this age of sentiment thing that's there as well, because of the backlash against rationalism, and with it now positivism and so on, you're also getting a rise in an emphasis on emotion. That your feelings are what really matter, your sentiments. These are the things that are of utmost importance, not rational knowledge, not empirical knowledge, none of those things. And then with this, we begin getting the rise of the idea of living an authentic life, being your authentic self, which is really the high road to expressive individualism.
Yeah, let me give the folks here a definition from the dictionary. It's not very, I think, thorough or complete, but at least kind of builds on what you've talked about. So when we talk about Romanticism, we're not talking about romance sort of genre literature for young women. We're talking about something that exists in the larger culture. So the definition from the dictionary is a movement in the arts and literature that originated in the late 18th century, emphasizing inspiration, subjectivity, and the primacy of the individual.
Yeah. I wanted to say real quickly, if it's okay, that one of the things we've talked about on other shows at different times is something that happened earlier in Western thought, where we had kind of realism, as we talked about at a different time, classical realism, in which there are universals, and there is a kind of universal logic, and there are real essences and kinds and that participate in these universals. And then we have a shift where that breaks. And we talked about some of the aspects of that nominalism, where things come down to the individual and the particular, that there is no real universals. They're conventions we use to talk about them. And then voluntarism in view of God and humans, which the will starts to take center shape. And I think you could say that Romanticism owes a lot to reiterating that emphasis. Isaiah Berlin, who wrote a lot on that, right. Who's a philosopher who taught at Oxford, Jewish philosopher, but he has this quote where he says, the Romanticism as a movement was a passionate protest against universality of any kind. And then his second thing is the emphasis was on a free, untrammeled will in the denial of a fact that there are any true nature of things. And so their attempt, he said, is to actually blow up and explode the whole notion of a stable structure. So that was something he kind of added to the mindset compared to the Enlightenment that wanted stable structures grounded in an absolute.
Well, that's a good place to sort of insert kind of the way people just down the street would talk about this. There was a time when many people in just run-of-the-mill everyday life would talk about absolute truth. So when we talk about absolute truth, we're talking about universal truth, right? We're talking about a truth that's true for all, not true for some people and not for others. It's just reality as such. And today we live in a world of like special interest groups and subjectivity, and you wouldn't understand because you're not whatever. And so that today we have a kind of balkanization in just about every society, where we've lost touch with things that we have in common. It's just like Tower of Babel. We can hardly talk to each other anymore because we're so wrapped up in our personal experiences, and we don't think about what human nature is or what truth is or what reality is. We're just talking about what our personal feelings are and impressions are.
Yeah, I was going to say, just interestingly, Isaiah Berlin said that was one of the things the true romantics would have delighted in. It was all about the fight for the particular in the individual, in their own creation and self-creation. So having a society that didn't have people passionately committed to actually asserting their own will on everything in the conflict that arises, for him, that was, in many cases, at the heart of a lot of the romantic project.
Yeah, one of the things that might be good to talk about too is maybe some particular examples of the way Romanticism is sort of plays out in different ways in the arts. So, like when you think about literature, someone like Wordsworth comes to mind, or Coleridge, and the poetry that we can see that they produce, or even William Blake. In his famous songs of innocence and experience. Maybe it'd be good to even maybe read for folks The Tiger or The Lamb, just to kind of play with that a little bit.
Well, actually, I would like to go to Germany first.
Okay.
Because what you see emerging in German Romanticism is two different images of what the hero is. Mm. And you can illustrate both of them from the work of Goethe.
Yeah.
The first of them, romantic hero type 1, is the man of destiny, who seizes the moment and moves forward, following his own lights and doing what he believes is right, and ends up triumphing. Our best example of that is Faust. In the original medieval story that Goethe based his poem on, Faust ended up damned. But Faust ends up redeeming him, in a sense. He escapes from the damnation that he brought on himself fundamentally because of love. But he didn't want this kind of, man of destiny, this kind of hero. He could not bring himself to have him end up in hell. Because this is the triumphant hero. Okay. Now the other is a novel hero that's much less well known. This is romantic hero type 2, which is called The Sorrows of Young Werther.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Now in the Sorrows of Young Werther, I'm not going to go through the.
Now, young Werther is like woke before his time. He's kind of he's woke in sort of the artistic sense of sort of self-destruction, self-pity, and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, basically, his parents want him to get a lucrative career. He wants to be an artist. He fails as an artist. One thing after another. His entire life is going wrong, one step after another. Everything he does, because he's trying to stay true to himself, everything that he does fails. He won't, he won't play game. He gets a job with a count, but he won't play the court game. So he ends up being basically ostracized. All kinds of things like this, one thing after another. And the thing that ends up being the cherry on top is he falls in love with a woman who is engaged to be married to someone else. And
of course,
ultimately, when he realizes he can't have her, he decides that the only solution is to kill himself. Now this may not seem like a hero, but this becomes a type in Romantic literature. This, you've got the man of destiny on the one hand and the wuss on the other.
Now, with that, but there is a kind of noble, I guess, poet kind of. He was true to his poetic vision, to his own impoverishment,
and that's what makes him a hero to Goethe. Now, the interesting thing is, when the novel came out, there was a spate of suicides across Germany of young men.
Right.
Wow. Well, it's. I mean, you see that with a similar emphasis today. We just had statistics come out on the level of attempts at suicide among young people, where all the emphasis is on being your true inner authentic self. And this is one of the things I think that arises then, this whole notion of the individual self, the self as self-constructed piece of art, and that martyrdom or self-sacrifice becomes something good for its own sake if it is carried out, no matter what you're martyred for, as long as it is saying true to who you have, who you truly are, whatever that may be. So it's radically particular, individual, and it doesn't really have an orientation towards any higher good than the self and its authenticity.
Right, and the interesting thing there is the exception to that is someone who gets murdered as a Christian missionary or something like that is not really considered to be particularly admirable.
That's right.
Because, well, they're not being true to their authentic self. They're being true to something outside themselves that they just sort of force themselves into the mold. That isn't really who they are.
That's right.
Well, I think what's at work underneath all of this, though, as you've noted sort of early on, is that there's a kind of Rousseauian sort of understanding of authenticity, which is sort of the spontaneous, sort of emotional sort of surge that comes from within, that's pre-rational. In other words, it exists before you think. And then what comes later is, your thinking, and what you're supposed to do with your thinking is justify whatever this kind of inner kind of movement is, and figure out ways to sort of play it out. We see that on a mass scale in our society now. But I guess one of the things I'd like to kind of get into, and bringing up Germans made me think about other forms of art. Beethoven, for example, is a great romantic composer. And if you want to contrast him with what would be understood as being a more classical composer, you'd have Mozart. So if you take, Mozart, and you think about what Mozart accomplishes in, say, the Jupiter Symphony, it's very moving, but it's also mathematically beautiful. There's a kind of structure to that piece that is a celebration of sort of the structure of the cosmos. Whereas with Beethoven, if you take dun 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 dun, and then you just have this kind of progression where you're repeating the same set of notes in different keys and in different patterns. It's intended to kind of sort of elicit a kind of a strong emotional response. This is one of the things that catches people by surprise. There were riots that would break out in symphony halls across Europe when Beethoven was played. You know about this, Tom. You're a music guy. But yeah. it was just so at the time it was so kind of breaking the pattern that people knew and believed in, that it was really radical. And then when we think about the visual arts, a lot of people love the Impressionists, but Impressionism is a kind of romantic approach to the visual, painting in particular. And, it's about, Impressionism is about the impression that light makes upon the eye and the soul. And it's not as kind of an attempt to capture something objective. It's an attempt with Impressionism. We think about, people like Van Gogh or Monet. They're going for sort of, it's kind of this sort of rational response. And a lot of people, will say, "How dare you criticize Van Gogh?" or "How dare you criticize Monet?" I'm not criticizing. I'm just trying to point out what they were up to. It was a very self-conscious thing.
Yeah, we have to add one more component in there. It's the impression of the moment. It is what they're trying to do is capture the play of light in the sense that it produces at a specific moment. That is why you will find paintings of haystacks.
Yeah.
That one after another, because as the light progresses, the haystack changes, and they want to, it produces a different impression.
Right. Now, that doesn't mean these things are valueless. It's just what we're talking about here is something different, and there are some interesting ways that these things reflect some positive and some negative things that are going on, in culture, generally speaking.
Yeah. As far as Beethoven goes, the term that they used in Germany was Sturm und Drang, which means storm and stress.
Yeah.
And again, in a sense, we're back to young Werther.
Yeah.
Although you could also find elements of this within Faust as well. That it's this very tempestuous kind of music that is that Kenneth Clark said that the Romantics were obsessed with the sublime.
Right.
Waterfalls, thunderstorms, mountains, these kinds of things, and that shows up in this Sturm und Drang in their music and in their literature.
Now, define the sublime for our listeners.
The sublime is something that is beautiful, but it actually is something that sort of transcends beauty. It is something that is larger and grander, so that the basic category of beauty almost doesn't apply to it, because it transcends it. It goes beyond it. So think of the feeling standing beside a great waterfall, the feeling that gives you. Or a couple of days ago, I was in Orlando, Florida, and we had one heck of a thunderstorm. And, that thunderstorm, it would be a good example of something that lifts you outside of yourself. That's the sort of thing that we're dealing with the sublime.
Yeah, and I think of like the Hudson, school of the, painting where you have these vast canvases. I mean, some of them are huge. We're talking about 10 feet, wide and 8 feet high, and they're portraying some, Western landscape in there, and a tiny, as tiny specks in the corner, you've got a camp of human beings, sort of overshadowed by this vast wilderness.
Yeah, and that's a peculiarly American style of romantic painting.
Right.
You don't find that in Europe, but the frontier is an extremely important part of the American psyche, especially during this period. Yeah. Frederick Jackson Turner actually argued that the frontier, historian actually from the University of Wisconsin, Turner argued that the frontier is what made America what it was, and the existence of the frontier was critical to America's self-understanding. So these vast vistas where you were just a small, tiny speck in it, to Turner, that is getting at the root of what America is about.
And it's interesting on that point, because one of the things of Romanticism was this immanentizing of the divine, and made it almost a kind of pantheism in which the spiritual and the natural were intertwined or one of the same. And so what you have now is this making sacred of, like you say, landscapes and things like this, to where you have this almost immanentized transcendence, rather than a transcendence within the immanence, in which that space becomes almost sacred, that we're a part of. And so there is this organic connectedness to thing. You'll see this in theology with someone like Schleiermacher with the Gefühl, this feeling of absolute dependence on this larger immanent space that we're a part of. So you have that, but then you do have, just to bring it up at some point, you do have this emphasis on the sacredness of cultures. And particular cultures have a certain sacredness to them, and they aren't all the same. And so you have this move with Herder and Hermann and different figures that returning to the language and the stories and the folk aspects of different cultures and bringing them into the fore.
Now, that would be a good place to kind of segue into some of the darker expressions of Romanticism when we get to the Nazis. But before we do that, I'd like to spend a little bit of time on the American religious experience and how I think Romanticism relates to it. So it's not a coincidence that revivalism emerges at this time. Now, revivalism, with Cane Ridge and, the sawdust trails and the camp meetings and all that kind of stuff, places a tremendous emphasis on experience. You're supposed to have this kind of overwhelming, powerful experience that reorients you. Now, I'm not saying that this is completely cultural in character, but it's I think worth noting that this happens at the same time, and I don't think it's a coincidence. At the same time, when everybody is talking about going out and sort of experiencing the sublime in the natural world, what are people doing? They're holding camp meetings in the wilderness. When people are talking about the importance of authenticity and sincerity, we have movements like the Primitive Methodists and the Primitive Baptists who are all talking about getting back to that New Testament experience that they read about in Acts, 2-4. So there's a kind of getting back to the garden kind of thing that's going on. And then there's this strong sort of emotional, when you think about Pentecostalism, I think Pentecostalism is one of those things. Basically what Pentecostalism does, I'm going to throw out an idea here. I'd like to see what you think. It takes the ecstatic experiences of kind of monks and nuns and democratizes them, and says that everybody needs to have these same kinds of experiences. So what do you think about that?
You can actually make that argument about the Reformation, that the Reformation was doing the same thing, taking the spirituality of the monasteries and making it for everyone. I think, though, that when you're looking at the roots of revivalism, you have to realize that there were, well, first of all, the roots really are in Puritanism. The Puritans insisted on conversion, a conversion experience of sorts, far more than anybody else within the Protestant tradition. That then gets picked up in the evangelical awakenings, the Wesleyan revival, the Welsh revival, the Great Awakening in America, and so on. The difference between that and what you see in the Second Great Awakening is those awakenings were based really on detailed exposition of Scripture and probing sermons that challenged people to look at their conscience, look at their behavior, look at their thoughts, and recognize what those look like to God. Whereas in the Second Great Awakening, there is a much more emotional style of preaching. I mean, Finney even said, if you take the following steps, you will get a revival. And it's really psychological manipulation.
Yeah.
And Jonathan Edwards was really trying to distinguish between true and false revival with things like the emotion, the religious affections. How do you tell whether this is real or something put on? You don't get that later. So that's where this expressive individualism style comes in. It's with that Second Great Awakening.
It's interesting to note that the etymology of ecstasy means to get out of yourself. Whereas with kind of the emotivism of much of the revivalism is almost kind of a getting into yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think personally that this is one of the things that plagues evangelicalism, that because there is so much emphasis on your conversion, I don't know how many kids I know that grew up as evangelicals that accepted Christ multiple times because they weren't sure they did it right the first time. Yeah. And the reason for that is because they were looking at their life and they didn't have the same feelings. They didn't have that same experience. So they were worried about whether or not they were actually saved. Where the real question isn't, did you have the experience? The real question is, do you have faith?
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting because it gets wedded to other aspects of I think the darker side of Romanticism's trajectory, and that we find as it enters in, of course, to the therapeutic, where it shifts over to no longer is it an experience that conforms to a kind of general evangelical experience, but it becomes my experience and my authenticity with God, my journey. You hear all this language now, like, my adventure with God, and so it all gets woven around the self and the particular expression of the self. We see it even in the music, right? Trying to express their art for the Lord, and there is a real dimension there that is Christian, but it starts to take center stage, and I think this grows out of stuff that is very much steeped in Romanticism.
Yeah, there's the Babylon Bee article that said something about the Holy Spirit couldn't come down because the fog machine broke. But again, what's going on there? It is you're using your music, you're using your lighting, your effects to try to generate an emotional experience, because we believe that emotion is truth, that your emotions are a guide to truth when they're anything but.
Yeah.
Well, that's the thing that I think that is lost, and why we're seeing such crazy stuff all around us, even in the church. We've lost our ability to check it and challenge these things. One of the things that I think is worth reflecting on is the fact that heresy is a kind of subtle misreading or a subtle move away from the truth that is hard, maybe in the early phases of its development, to identify. So when we think about, say, something that is as slippery as Gnosticism, we can say, well, of course it's important to remember things that Jesus said, like, it's better to lose an eye than to have your whole body thrown into hell, or it's the idea that what will you give in exchange for your soul? It's better to preserve that and lose everything else. And that sense of distinction between things that are important can slip into a kind of complete dismissal of the physical and the importance of certain cultural realities that we enjoy because of God's grace in our lives and common grace in our culture. And that can lead to a withdrawal from just even ethics, where people are just so wrapped up in their own personal experience that they just lose touch with the outside world.
Well, and I think it's the combination. I mean, for example, I'm not the first to note, I think many note recently that subjectivity in the right sense of the word in many ways is a byproduct of our faith. I mean, you read the Psalms, praise the Lord, O my soul, all that is in me, let it praise your name. There's this communal language, but it isn't all about the self. It's about the self in communion, and it doesn't lead just to individual. It is about being a person of covenant and a person who enacts that within relationships and in the world. So subjectivity is something that you read Augustine. There's a lot of talk in the same direction. I mean, he's one of the one who develops this whole notion of the psychological analogies of the Trinity. So we have that there. It's a deformed Augustinianism, I think, that you start to see develop, as I said, with voluntarism and some of its byproducts. And so this takes the Augustinian notion of the significance of the will, but it makes it run the wrong direction and run loose and severs it off from, again, the rational. And so the Romantics celebrated, this opposition to the rational, the universal, the essential, so they were happy to see the conflicts that would arise from such irrationality. And I think that's really where, as Glenn was hinting at, the dark side really starts to take hold, because once we're seeing it today. Once you've lost the measure of rational discourse and the ability, especially in public resolve, to come to some sort of understanding, what you have is a competition of wills, and the only thing that can quell it is either going to be some kind of dominance or some kind of extreme violence. And this is, I think, where the negative kind of nationalism and the flip side totalitarianism become very attractive in worlds that are under these conditions.
Well, you remember the great propaganda film, The Triumph of the Will. Guess which group of people, were behind that. So maybe we should think a little bit about how, various dark sort of forces kind of get unleashed and even justified through this kind of movement that we call Romanticism. Do you have any thoughts on that, Glenn? How this all kind of works out?
Yeah, that's actually where I wanted to head next. The curious thing is that it mingles, to pick one specific example, it ends up mingling with scientific theories, specifically Darwinism.
Right.
And when you combine this idea of the folk, the people, who are one tribe, let's call it, what you get is the idea that tribe needs to survive, and the way it does that is it outcompetes the others.
Now, I want to have a little fun here with folks. How many people drive Volkswagens here? We got a Volkswagen driver here. Were you aware that it was the car of the Nazi Party? Well, we're talking about the modern. They've repented, but it's the wagon of the people, the folk. People didn't, it's kind of fun, you think about these things.
So what Hitler did is very specifically combine these romantic ideas about the folk, about the tradition, he really wanted to bypass Christianity and go back to the old folkish ways and so on, and then combined it with Darwinism. And what you get then is the idea that the Aryan race is the only fully human race. They're superior to all others, and therefore they have the right to take whatever they need from the lesser peoples around them by force if necessary, which it generally is.
Yeah, there's something here I think it's worth noting, and I think it's often lost on us. The Jews were simply the first. They weren't the end of the process. In other words, if they had been able to, sort of secure their rule, there would have been others in line.
Well, there already were. The Jews didn't start it. It was the handicapped. It was homosexuals. It was gypsies. It was Slavs. And the Jews are somewhere in the middle there. I mean, so this is this folkish ideology coming out of a German Romanticism run amok. German Romanticism combined with really, really bad anthropology.
Yeah.
I mean, the Germans were not Aryans. I mean, but the Aryans were the original in terms of the way they understood things. The Aryans were the original Indo-European people. And there was a German anthropologist who argued that they were actually the ancestors of the Germans, which is completely wrong. But the word Arya means noble in Indo-European. So they were the noble people, which of course the Germans meant us. Right. And Hitler picked up on this bad anthropological and linguistic argument. Now, what's interesting, though, is that when you consider this matter of your identity, your primary identity in Nazism is not as an individual, actually in any form of fascism. You're not an individual. You're a cog in the wheel. You are part of the state. You're part of the folk. Your individual existence doesn't matter. You're an ant in a colony. Now, the thing that I find striking about that is effectively that's what critical theory argues.
Oh, yeah, we're back to it. Yeah, right.
Yeah, all you are is a representative of your particular folk. And everything about you is determined by the folk that you're part of. Right. So this is even coming in and helping to shape modern political theory.
Well, one of the if you notice kind of one of the tensions that are going on, let's use American politics for this case. What you have is a worry within the attention or anxiety between fighting groups, let's say right and left, and just to use a typology here. What you have is a fear from the left that you have an irrational nationalism arising with someone like Trump, right? Or someone like a MAGA movement. And their fear is this is an irrational movement and it's going to be dangerous because it's not going to be able to be contained. But the flip side is the alternative is a hyper irrational expressivism where they combine the radical self-expressive constructivism of identity, like transgenderism, all the different groups, mixed with a similar irrational group. And those groups are incommensurable. And so therefore, the only thing they can connect with is where they fit in the victim chain. And that becomes what unites them in a way to be an opposing force to the irrational or fearful nationalism. So nationalism can't be a good group. It has to be all these victims.
Yeah, and you can add to that Philip Brief's idea of death works. If you look, let's take the best example. You look at the LGBTs, and we'll just stop at T. Lesbians and gays historically never got along.
Right.
The only thing that they have in common, and add bisexuals in at this point, the only thing that they have in common with each other is they oppose traditional morality. That's the only thing that holds them together. Transgenders fit in even worse because if you can be transgender, lesbian and gay no longer has meaning.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So it creates a very unstable cocktail. And the only thing that holds them together is their opposition to traditional moral values.
Yeah. That's right. So which means that when traditional morality goes away, I'm not saying it will, but if it were kind of hypothetically, they'd be at each other's throats. They wouldn't last very long either.
In a few years.
One generation, and they're done.
Right. So I'd like to switch toward the more positive side of Romanticism, because there's very definitely a dark side. We have the whole expressive individualism thing. We have this idea of folk ideologies. We have all of these kinds of things. But there's also something really important in here that we touched on in our discussion about the medieval mind of C.S. Lewis. Mm-hmm. Lewis is impossible. He does not develop his worldview without the Romantic movement. Tolkien doesn't develop his worldview or his world without the Romantic movement. Yeah. Both of them were really, in a lot of ways, rebelling against the modern world. They're rebelling against the meaninglessness that comes from scientism. They're rebelling against technology. They're rebelling against the ravaging of the planet. They're rebelling against the abuse of traditional cultures, village life, those kinds of things. And they see the world in a radically different way than most of their contemporaries. And this is only possible because they were heavily influenced by the Romantics. People like William Morris, George MacDonald, and others.
This might be a good point to bring up a particular word that's a German word that Lewis uses, Sehnsucht, to talk about this very thing you're getting at.
Yeah, Sehnsucht is an idea. Lewis translates it into English using the word joy, but he's got a very idiosyncratic definition of joy. What it is the way I would describe it is that something in this world gives you a glimpse of something beyond this world, something that is beautiful, something that is sublime, something that is infinitely desirable, but something you cannot attain, at least not in this life.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
What you have happening with Lewis, and I think Tolkien similarly, is you have them taking the the good aspects of Romanticism and placing them within a realism. I mean, with Lewis, you definitely have it right there in his Christian Platonism. In this way, they're not detached from the rational order, but there is an aspect to them that, just like the rational order, goes beyond the rational order to the ground of all rationality. And so there is a rich web there. And I think with Tolkien, you see something similar coming from it, more from a different kind of emphasis. But this is why you see figures today like Alison Milbank and people who really respect Chesterton and Tolkien. And she writes a book called Tolkien and Chesterton as Theologians, because they see that there is a healthy line in Romanticism that was also indebted to a lot of realism and could be re-employed within it. Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Just so our
go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, just so our listeners know the correct spelling, because the way it's pronounced, as English speakers, we would never get to this spelling. But it's spelled Sehnsucht. It's pronounced Sehnsucht. Just so you know. So if you're looking it up, now you know how to spell it and look it up. But it means longing, desire, yearning, or craving.
There's actually a Welsh word which I don't remember off the top of my head, but it refers to a longing and a nostalgia for a place you have never been, a place you've never seen, and that's hitting the exact same kind of concept.
Right.
The thing that we have to remember here is that for all of the faults of the way Romanticism went, they were objecting to things that are genuinely objectionable.
Yeah, exactly.
So when we think about,
you can have a positive side to this.
Yeah. So when we think about, William Blake, I think it was William Blake who referred to the dark satanic mills of England. In other words, there was a sense in which these, industrial sort of monsters were inhuman and crushing people. And there's a kind of perception that this is not good. I mean, this is not healthy to see people sort of thrown into this machinery this way. So, I mean, we can look back on it and say, well, don't you understand all the good things that came out of the Industrial Revolution? Well, of course we do, but who would like to be involved, in those factories, particularly as children, right? Yeah. So these are things that are kind of in the air, and people are along. Another thing is sort of the dry rationalism of certain forms of the Enlightenment, or sort of certain ways that the Enlightenment gets expressed. If you want to really get as dry as dust philosophy as you can possibly get, read Kant, who would be considered, like the kind of the pinnacle of Enlightenment rationality. And so people are sort of reacting to that. They're saying this stuff is so dry, so sterile, so just lifeless. How can anybody be inspired by it?
Yeah. I mean, you saw that similarly. Criticism of what is called neo-Thomism in post-scholastic theology, where they took Thomas's very rich system and applied it. Almost became like logarithms. I mean, it became very dry, just question and answer, and then the life was out of it. And this is why you could see the Renaissance influence with the Reformation was to breathe life into something that had become so stale and dead. And so what you do is you have these oppositions develop. Things get very dry, and rationality becomes very limited. And it leaves out all those aspects of humanity, the imagination, the metaphorical, the analogical, all these aspects that can't be reduced to just the cognitive proposition. And I mean, well, just explained within a kind of syllogism or a logical formula. And so you see the attraction is to retrieve a bigger picture. The problem is they go all the way to the other side, and then they cut it off from rationality. And so I think what Lewis and Tolkien are doing, trying to bring those things into a proper balance.
Yeah, right. It's interesting that you should bring up the Renaissance, because I've long argued that the Renaissance is a romantic movement. It's a reaction to the stresses of its own era, where they're looking back to find a golden age in the past that never really existed, but that they wanted to be there. They jumped over the Middle Ages and got to Rome in Greece. Yeah. The later Romantics jump over the modern period and land into the Middle Ages that the Renaissance rejected. But it's essentially the same kind of response. And what you find among the Renaissance humanists is their fundamental argument is dialectic or logic is not the road to truth. Rhetoric is. Clarity is more important as a criterion for truth than logic is.
Yeah.
And there are huge debates about this in the 16th century, right as the Reformation is getting rolling.
Now, that's interesting, Glenn, because many people would associate rhetoric with sophistry.
There is a good argument to be made there, but their point was that what is clear is true.
Yeah. Okay. Lucid brevity, isn't that the lucid brevity was the Reformation?
That's the direction that especially the Puritans go. Where the Puritans are going to take this emphasis on rhetoric, and they're going to say, we don't need... If you ever want to see an example of rhetoric gone amok, read the opening sentence. That's all you need. The opening sentence of Boccaccio's description of plague. I got that one in now too. Boccaccio's description of plague in Florence. It is so florid as to be almost impenetrable. The Puritans reacted to that, and they insisted that what you needed was plain and simple preaching. So they're very straightforward with this. Now they've got their own way of approaching rhetoric. They've also got their own way of approaching logic, which was actually following Philippe Rameau in France, where instead of syllogisms, he breaks everything up into binaries. But that's a different issue. The point, though, is that the analogy to the Renaissance works, because the Renaissance, just like the Romantic period, was skipping over the era that came before it as they understood time periods and finding a golden age in the past that they wanted to live in. This is why you get all the medievalism in the Renaissance and the obsession, the cult of antiquities it's called, this obsession with ancient Greece and Rome in the Renaissance. Both of them are doing the same thing, and in somewhat surprising ways, they're reacting to very similar sorts of things. You've got Enlightenment rationalism, you've got positivism, you've got all of that, but you also have scholasticism in a dry, barren, arid, by this point, typically a pretty barren, syllogistic way of building systems that have no real connection to life.
Yeah.
So one of the things here I think it's worth kind of reflecting a little bit on is this tendency that we seem to have to either choose a golden age in the past to sort of measure ourselves against and get back to, or a golden age in the future against which to sort of mark our progress and sort of obliterate the past because we think that the past is keeping us from it. Any thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, you've got Star Trek. At least the original Star Trek. It's changed. But the original Star Trek is this idea of finding a golden age in the future when reason and rationality and humane values and all of that are going to triumph. But you're going to have the humane values triumph without any foundation for them.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Although I've got a theory about classic Trek, so let me just throw out my theory about classic Trek because it's the only Trek, just so people know. But in classic Trek, what you have is a kind of interesting set of personalities with Spock, the Stoic, Bones, the Romantic, and the personification of the Western tradition, James Tiberius Kirk. Now, think about his name. James the Just, the Hebraic tradition. Tiberius, Roman. Kirk, church. He is the embodiment of the Western tradition. And if you look at the episodes, now you may not like William Shatner, but if you think about just like the particular episodes, the Christian themes are continually being brought up in different episodes. There's actually an episode where they go to a planet that's actually a 20th century version of the Roman Empire. And they actually see the Christian faith emerging in that world at that time. So this is something that, Gene Roddenberry, I think, you look at it and you say, there's just no way this was a coincidence. He's kind of busy with this.
And how many of their episodes involved de facto time travel?
Yeah.
There was one where they were in Nazi Germany. There was one that they're in this Roman Empire thing. It's a way of exploring the past through the lens of this idealized future.
Right. There was even an episode where they tried to go back to Eden. There was a kind of but it was a bunch of hippies. I don't know if you remember that one. They were drugged out hippies. But anyway, so I could nerd out on classic Trek, but let's move on. You were going to say something there, Tom.
Well, just back to the previous point is, I know in theology we will talk about sort of creation and eschatology, right? And there is this attempt, like you said, of people who there is this attempt to go back to Eden, and as if we can, or there's an attempt to live now in light, or sacrifice everything now to a particular future, a utopia, achievable again, usually through our own resources or the right kind of orienting of ourselves in an immanentistic way. Whereas, the disruptive element in Christianity, that there is a fall that cuts us from going to that golden age. And then the fact that there is a culmination, but it's going to be a culmination that's brought by an act of God, not merely by, human endeavor. So that places a tension then. So what you have is, but then you add the Christian church, which in some ways is the carrier of both. The retrieval of creation and the resurrection of Christ and the self-enactment of that. So there is a form of life that we are to accord to and does share in a certain kind of creaturely participation in what it means to be a creature. And then moving it towards its perfection as it puts off the old and puts on the new. And so we're able to hold those things together without making one become an ideology or a kind of a delusion that we reinterpret everything else in light of. So there is a way to hold those things in place as a Christian that I don't think can be done outside of it in any significant way. And usually it's most harmful when they try it.
It's interesting that we have an angel with a flaming sword to keep us from going back to Eden. There's no going back. And then, as you noted, there's no ability that we possess to sort of immanentize the eschaton, as Eric Voegelin said. We can't actually bring that future into the present the way we would like. We have to wait for God to do something, the new creation, new heaven, new earth. In the meantime, there is a heaven above. And so we can transcend the, sort of the limitations and the suffering that we experience in the moment, because there is a God who providentially is ordering all things, who is above us and makes our lives meaningful in the face of all of the evil that we're up against. But that's a dimension to the Christian faith that is very unaddressed today. You don't have anybody talking about that.
Well, it's also worth noting that if you go back to the great works of medieval literature, all of them are ultimately stories of failure. Song of Roland, Roland dies. Beowulf dies. The Nibelungenlied, everybody dies.
Yeah.
I mean, we
You're cheering us up, Glenn. You're cheering us up.
Norse mythology, the world comes to an end, but there's a rebirth. I mean, but the reason why this is important is, once again, look at Tolkien and Lewis. Look at the end of Narnia. The end of Narnia is destroyed, but there's redemption. People go further up and further in. Look at the Lord of the Rings. Galadriel talks about fighting the long defeat. There's a very clear sense in Tolkien and Lewis, which is very deeply embedded in medieval literature and, frankly, in historic Christianity, that there is no way we are ever going to be able to achieve the end state. We're never going to be able to bring paradise in. That is going to take a cataclysmic act of God for that to happen. Now, all you post-millennialists out there, you can think about that all you want, but this is what the historic Christian tradition has argued, and it's one of the things that I think that this recovery of the medieval traditions, plus the experience of World War I, really embedded deeply in Lewis and Tolkien in their philosophy.
Let me speak up for the post-millennial view.
I knew somebody would.
There are two ways to think about it. One way is to think that we have the capacity to bring about, because of the work of the Spirit in the church, this golden age. The other is that it's simply a fact, or simply a promise, that we will see the gospel succeed in its progress across the world, but we still have to wait for God to do what only God can do, which is create the new heaven and the new earth. I'm of the second school.
Yeah, and I think, and my point a minute ago was more to say that more emphasizing the way in which people try to assume that their action is enough. You see this with sort of Protestant liberalism, that we're bringing about progress, we're bringing about the kingdom, if you will, and of course they would gloss it with language of it, the Spirit's imminent work, and this is of course God's work, but we're the stage on which this is taking place, and we're the agents actualizing it. We see this with panentheism of Jürgen Moltmann, right? That God is becoming more and more realizable and actualized as we are the consciousness of God enacting itself out in our actions in the world. So you have this kind of stuff going on. So that was kind of what I was after. I do think a different case could be made that to talk about the way in which divine and human action are not in competition and carrying this out. But I think what Moltmann and liberal Protestantism do is they melt them into each other. The human being is basically the vehicle through which the kingdom is coming, not God's action.
Well, it reminds me of that publication, The Christian Century, which has got to be like the greatest irony in the history of Christianity that somebody would name a publication that is founded right at the turn of the 20th century with sort of this post-millennial liberal kind of optimism, The Christian Century, right before World War I, the Depression, World War II, the Cold War, the Holocaust, all these things. By the end of the 20th century, people have pretty much gotten over the idea that the 20th century would be the Christian century. Everybody's kind of looking back and saying, no, that wasn't the Christian century. But that's what people were thinking when the 19th century was turning and we entered the 20th century. There was a publication. A lot of folks don't remember it. I remember it. It was still sort of available in many theological libraries in the 80s and 90s. I don't know if it still exists. Maybe it doesn't anymore. But who knows? No one's reading it. I know that.
Yeah. Well, if you want a good example of this sort of triumphalism, just look at the hymn Jerusalem.
Yeah.
19th century British hymn that basically says we're bringing in the new Jerusalem, and it's England.
Right. That's interesting how it is sort of like is synonymous with the empire.
Yep.
Well, we've got to that point where we should probably wrap things up. Is there anything you want to say, Tom, as we do? We're going to have a little question and answer time here following the show with the folks who are present for the live taping of the show. But so don't run away. But do you have anything you want to say, Tom, as we wrap up?
No, just it's a topic I think we could spend a long time with because it's kind of getting into some of the riches that we can delve into in terms of its impact. It's everywhere. And I think we could spend a lot of time just on the way and the significant and important aspects that Christians should grab a hold of and orient the right way, because I think Lewis and Tolkien taught us much in terms of its value. But it has that dark side worth always remembering.
Right. Anything you want to say, Glenn?
Yeah, I just want to put more emphasis. I mean, the negative side is something that we've hit on a bunch of times. I think we need to recognize the positive side, that you're never going to get the medieval mind of C.S. Lewis without Romanticism, and that they were, in fact, reacting, however wrongly in many cases, to genuine problems that we as Christians should be opposing as well.
Well, that's good stuff. Anyway, thanks a lot for listening to the Theology Pugcast. We appreciate your interest in the show. We have people who support the show financially every month. We thank those folks for that. I mean, the gifts really do take care of the ongoing costs of producing the show, and it's really appreciated. We also appreciate folks who take the time to give us 5-star ratings on their podcast platform of choice. And so if you want to do that, again, that's appreciated. If you don't like us, why did you listen so long? Why didn't you just shut off the show? Just go away. People don't have to like everything. It's okay. But anyway, we're glad that you like the show enough to wait to listen to the very end. And we'll be back and have another show next week. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Bye.